Now, in anticipation of a large number of children expected to cross borders into South Africa to visit relatives this long Easter weekend, South Africa's Department of Social Development and their Zimbabwean counterparts are working closely to ensure safety of children. Now, for more on this conversation, we're now joined by Chairperson of the African Diaspora Forum, Dr. Vusimuzi Sibanda, who joins us from the capital in Pretoria. Dr. Sibanda, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, the Border Management Authority will be on high alert this weekend, including the Department of Social Development, all hands on deck for the Easter weekend. Wouldn't this be a great approach to have this rigorous approach as well all year round, though?
Thank you very much. Good evening, and good evening to all the viewers. Yes, indeed. I think this is just our view as well that, this kind of, operation should not be a once-off operation simply because of the Easter holidays, because the problems related with, to child trafficking or human trafficking are very rampant, and particularly which involve children coming from neighboring countries to visit, maybe parents, especially during holidays and so forth. So we need a campaign that is going to be ongoing, that is going to conscientize even the parents to be aware that it is breaking the law, because a lot of them simply think it's my child visiting me, but they're not really, aware of the, legal ramifications there.
And, Dr. Sibanda, as you're speaking of this as well and how rampant of a problem it is as well, I just think of reports just from last year where there was 14 children who were found in a bus in Kimberley who were smuggled from Zimbabwe to South Africa. And like you're saying, these parents want to also spend time with their kids as well, but they're also posing a risk of child trafficking. Now, 2 Zimbabwean nationals have now been charged when it comes to that case of those 14 children. But what do we know about how the modus operandi of this? Because it is alleged that the bus operators are also involved and parents then pay them an additional fee to make sure that unaccompanied, undocumented children also make their way into the country.
It's very true. I mean, because in the bulk of the cases, they just don't go and kidnap these children. They go, obviously on instructions from parents to bring the children. And it turns out, if you look at it, it turns out to be very expensive. But I suppose lack of information is what becomes very problematic, because, every child now, unlike in the olden days where children, did not have passports, they were only endorsed in the parents' passport. Children today, can easily get passports from all different countries in the world. I think children have got separate passports. So if there is sufficient, campaign and, information to conscientize parents about the dangers, of letting children cross borders unaccompanied, the anxiety, the related likelihood that they would obviously find themselves, are being kidnapped, being trafficked and, traumatized in all these various ways. It would really help if the Department of Social Development makes, this campaign and drive, to be a continuous, exercise, because even parents, if they are charged for the mere fact that, they've had to let children travel unaccompanied without documentation, that would help and deter the problem. Because as it stands, we're hearing, as you're saying now, that 2 people have been charged. Those could be the drivers. Where are the parents of the 14 children? Where are the parents of the 400 children that, the children that were stopped at, the Bait post last year in December? So we need to hold parents to account.
Dr. Sibanda, also the Department of Home Affairs and the Border Management Authority make it clear in terms of what documentation is needed when children are traveling. Now, whether they are with a guardian or their parents, they would have to travel with a passport regardless. What makes it so difficult that these parents are finding that they would rather risk it, rather have their children posed this threat of child trafficking as opposed to going the necessary way?
Well, look, I really think that it's more real of lack of information, because if you have regard to, the traveling expenses of these children, you'd be told that it would cost a trip, to come to South Africa from neighboring countries on these buses about, 2,500, 3,000 a single trip. And a return trip would cost in the region of between 4,000 and 6,000. And if you look at the SADC countries, a passport would ordinarily cost them around, between 3,000 to about 4,000 or 5,000 rands, which means if parents had all this information, that all they need is ordinarily to make sure that they apply for it. Even if a parent doesn't have a passport, they are illegal in South Africa. They don't have to make the children also become illegal, because they can easily, acquire a passport, for that child, as the child does not need to be endorsing their own passport. So I think lack of information is one of those major problems, and the fear that if I don't have a passport, it means maybe my child does not get a passport. So we need a campaign that conscientizes parents to realize that apart from just even if the child does survive that experience, but the trauma of traveling 800, 1,000 kilometers, crossing the border, spending 24 hours on the road without a parent, not knowing where to alight and get food and get assistance, it's an experience that children would not really, take quite well. It's very problematic.
The whole concept of word of mouth as well. One parent does it and their child successfully makes it across the border, and thankfully nothing happens to them. And then that story spreads and spreads, and then it somewhat becomes a risk almost worth taking. But to your point, should the department be doing more educational drives to show and highlight how you can actually have your children travel legally? Looking at what a child would need traveling unaccompanied, according to the BMA, the child would then obviously need their passport as well. They would need a copy of their parents' passport. If their parents are deceased, they would need a copy of the death certificate as well as the birth certificates. Now, these are the kinds of documents that parents would have to their disposal should their child be traveling unaccompanied. But would you advise that in that case anyway?
Well, look, the truth of the matter is that for starters, we need the BMA, we need the Home Affairs, we need the government of South Africa, now that it has become a champion in trying to ensure that the problems associated with child trafficking are actually curbed, to ensure that it engages, all countries, within the region and probably Africa, to make sure that, this drive is engaged in across the continent, to make sure that children are not transported without proper documentation, so that it becomes an offense that is, that has got heavy sanctions in it. And the requirements obviously might not be the same in various countries, where, for example, maybe more documentation could be required, like where a copy of the parent's passport is required. Because indeed, if the copy of the passport is required, that could become, the problem under the circumstances, because some of these parents might not have a passport, but the likelihood is that all these parents do have some form of identification. So if a child has got a passport, all they need is the parent's copy of ID and an affidavit or letter or of a guardian who is, responsible for that child, so that the child can be, travel and they're allowed to do the traveling.
Well, hopefully that those calls and that advice also falls on the right ears as well. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa Today and sharing your insights with us.